The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Salem like a shroud, and Thomas Whitmore felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine as he made his way through the village square. Something was wrong. The usual chatter of merchants and townsfolk had been replaced by hushed whispers and fearful glances. Children who normally played freely in the streets now huddled close to their mothers' skirts, their eyes wide with terror. Thomas quickened his pace toward the small cottage where Elizabeth Hale lived at the edge of town. She had sent word the night before that little Samuel Cooper's fever had finally broken after 3 days of her careful ministrations. The boy had been near death, and the town physician had given up hope, but Elizabeth, with her knowledge of herbs and healing, had worked tirelessly to save him. As he approached her home, Thomas's heart stopped. A crowd had gathered outside, their faces twisted with anger and suspicion. Reverend Blackwood stood at the center, his black robes billowing in the morning breeze, his voice rising above the murmurs like a dark prophecy. "The devil walks among us," the Reverend declared, his pale eyes gleaming with fervor. Young Samuel Cooper lay dying, beyond the reach of godly medicine, yet this woman— He pointed an accusing finger toward Elizabeth's cottage. "This woman claims to have healed him with her unholy arts." Thomas pushed through the crowd, his chest tight with growing dread. Through the cottage window he could see Elizabeth inside, her face pale but resolute as she faced the mob gathering outside her door. Her long auburn hair caught the light, and for a moment Thomas remembered the first time he had seen her smile. Remembered the way she had looked at him with those green eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the earth. "She's a witch!" shrieked Mary Warren, the young servant girl who had become the town's most vocal accuser. "I seen her talking to the devil himself in the woods. She made a pact with him to save that boy." The crowd's murmur grew louder, more threatening. Thomas felt rage building in his chest. These people had known Elizabeth all her life. They had come to her when their children were sick, when their crops failed, when they needed comfort in their darkest hours. She had never turned anyone away, never asked for payment beyond what they could spare. "Elizabeth Hale!" Reverend Blackwood's voice boomed across the square. "By the authority vested in me by God and the colony of Massachusetts, you are hereby accused of practicing witchcraft and consorting with the devil." The cottage door opened, and Elizabeth stepped outside. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. She was beautiful and terrible in that moment, her chin raised defiantly, her eyes blazing with righteous anger. She looked like a queen facing her executioners, and Thomas felt his love for her swell like a tide in his chest. "I am guilty of nothing more than healing a child," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "If that is witchcraft, then every mother who comforts her crying infant is a witch." "Blasphemy!" Blackwood snarled. "You dare mock the word of God?" Thomas stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "Reverend, this is madness. Elizabeth Hale is no witch. She's a healer, a good Christian woman who has done nothing but help this community." Blackwood's cold gaze fixed on Thomas, and there was something dangerous in those pale eyes. "Thomas Whitmore," he said slowly, "I wonder what makes you so quick to defend this woman. Perhaps you too have fallen under her spell." The crowd turned to look at Thomas, and he saw suspicion beginning to bloom in their faces. Fear crawled up his spine like ice water. In Salem, accusation was tantamount to conviction, and conviction meant death. But as he looked at Elizabeth, saw the way she stood so bravely against the hatred of the mob, Thomas knew he would rather face the flames himself than let them take her without a fight. "I defend her because she is innocent," he said, his voice steady despite the terror in his heart. "And because someone must speak for justice in this godless place." The crowd gasped at his words, and Reverend Blackwood's smile was sharp as a blade. "Seize her," he commanded. "The witch will face trial at dawn." The courthouse reeked of fear and sweat as dawn broke over Salem. Thomas sat in the back row of wooden benches, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the seat. Elizabeth had been brought in just moments before, her wrists bound with rough rope, her once pristine dress now stained with the filth of her cell. Yet even in chains, she carried herself with a dignity that made Thomas's heart ache with pride and terror. Judge Samuel Hawthorne entered the courtroom like a specter of death itself, his gaunt face shadowed beneath his black judicial robes. The man had presided over 17 witch trials in the past month, and 17 souls had been condemned to die. His reputation for severity had spread throughout the colony like wildfire, and mothers now used his name to frighten their children into obedience. "The court will come to order," Hawthorne announced, his voice echoing off the wooden walls. "We are here to determine the guilt or innocence of one Elizabeth Hale, accused of practicing witchcraft, consorting with the devil, and using supernatural powers to bewitch the innocent." Thomas watched as Elizabeth was forced to stand in the defendant's box, a crude wooden cage that made her look like a wild animal on display. She lifted her chin and met the judge's gaze without flinching, and Thomas felt a surge of admiration for her courage. Reverend Blackwood rose from his seat like a dark angel of judgment. "Your Honor, the evidence against this woman is overwhelming. She has used unnatural means to heal the sick, speaking in tongues and invoking powers that no Christian woman should possess." "That's a lie!" Thomas started to rise, but a firm hand on his shoulder pushed him back down. His brother Jacob had appeared beside him, his face grim with warning. "Don't be a fool, Thomas," Jacob whispered urgently. "You'll only make things worse for her." Mary Warren was called as the first witness, her young face twisted with a mixture of fear and perverse excitement. She had become the town's most celebrated accuser, and Thomas could see how she reveled in the attention. "I seen her, Your Honor," Mary testified, her voice shaking with theatrical emotion. "In the woods at midnight, dancing naked around a fire, speaking words in a language that ain't of this world, and there was a dark figure with her, tall and terrible, with eyes like burning coals." Thomas felt sick. Every word was a fabrication, a poison designed to destroy the woman he loved. He thought of Elizabeth's gentle hands as she tended to the sick, remembered her voice singing hymns as she worked in her garden. This was not the woman Mary Warren described. "And what did you see this dark figure do?" Judge Hawthorne prompted. "He gave her a book, Your Honor, a black book with strange symbols, and she signed it with her own blood." Mary's voice rose to a shriek. "She sold her soul to the devil for the power to bewitch us all." More witnesses followed, each one adding their own lies to the growing pile of accusations. Thomas recognized most of them. People who had come to Elizabeth for help, who had begged her to heal their children, to ease their suffering. Now they stood before the court and condemned her for the very mercy she had shown them. Elizabeth was finally allowed to speak in her own defense, but Thomas could see it was a mockery. The judge's mind was already made up, his face set in stone as she pleaded her case. "I am a Christian woman," Elizabeth said, her voice clear and strong despite her circumstances. "I have never practiced witchcraft, never consorted with the devil. I heal with herbs and prayer, as my grandmother taught me, as her grandmother taught her. If that makes me a witch, then every woman who tends to the sick is guilty of the same crime." "Silence!" Hawthorne slammed his gavel down. "Your blasphemous words only confirm your guilt. You mock the very foundations of our faith with your arrogance." Thomas watched in horror as the judge's verdict was pronounced. "Elizabeth Hale, you have been found guilty of witchcraft by the testimony of these brave witnesses. You are hereby sentenced to death by burning at the stake. The execution will take place at sunset, 3 days hence, so that you may have time to repent your sins and make peace with your Maker." The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause, but Thomas heard none of it. His world had narrowed to Elizabeth's face, to the tears she refused to let fall, to the way she looked at him across the crowded room with eyes that held both love and farewell. As the guards led her away, Thomas felt something break inside his chest. 3 days. He had 3 days to find a way to save her or watch the woman he loved burn alive. The jail beneath Salem's courthouse was a place where hope came to die. Thomas descended the narrow stone steps, his boots echoing in the darkness, a single candle flickering in his trembling hand. The guard, a grizzled man named Silas, who had known Thomas since childhood, had allowed him this one visit in exchange for a handful of silver coins and a promise to keep silent about the arrangement. 5 minutes, Silas whispered, his voice hoarse with guilt. No more, or we'll both hang alongside her. The smell hit Thomas first, a mixture of human waste, rotting straw, and despair so thick it seemed to coat his throat. Cells lined both sides of the narrow corridor, most empty now, their previous occupants having already met their fate at the stake. Only 2 were occupied. One held a woman who had been accused of cursing her neighbor's cow, and the other held Elizabeth. Thomas's heart nearly stopped when he saw her. She sat on a pile of moldy straw in the corner of her cell, her beautiful dress torn and stained, her auburn hair hanging in tangles around her face. But when she looked up at him, her green eyes still held that fierce spirit that had first captured his heart. "Thomas," she whispered, rising to her feet and moving toward the iron bars. "You shouldn't have come. If they see you here—" "I don't care," Thomas said, reaching through the bars to cup her face in his hands. Her skin was cold, too cold, and he could feel her trembling beneath his touch. "Elizabeth, we have to get you out of here. I have a plan." She shook her head, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "There's no escape from this place, my love. The walls are too thick, the guards too vigilant, and even if I could flee, where would I go? They would hunt me to the ends of the earth. Then we'll leave together," Thomas said fiercely. "We'll go west, to the frontier, where no one knows our names. We'll build a new life away from this madness." Elizabeth pressed her face against the cold iron bars, and Thomas could see the war raging in her eyes. Hope battling against despair, love fighting against fear. "Thomas, there's something I must tell you, something that will change everything." The candlelight flickered across her face, casting shadows that made her look older, more fragile. Thomas felt his stomach clench with dread. "What is it?" "I'm with child," she whispered, her voice so quiet he almost missed it. "Your child. I've known for a month now, but I was waiting for the right moment to tell you." Thomas felt the world tilt beneath his feet. A child, their child, growing inside her even now, innocent and perfect, condemned to die with its mother before it ever drew breath. The injustice of it hit him like a physical blow, and he had to grip the bars to keep from falling. "All the more reason to get you out," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our child will not die in this place. I won't allow it." "How can you save us?" Elizabeth asked, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat belly. "The whole town has turned against me. Even your own brother thinks I'm guilty." "Jacob doesn't matter," Thomas said, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. His brother had made his feelings clear that morning, warning Thomas to stay away from Elizabeth or risk being accused himself. "I have friends, people who remember the good you've done. Samuel Cooper's father owes you his son's life. Martha Proctor knows you helped her through her darkest hour when her husband died. They'll help us." Elizabeth's expression grew pained. "Thomas, you're not thinking clearly. These people are terrified. They'll say anything, do anything to save themselves from accusation. You can't trust them." "Then I'll do it alone," Thomas said, his voice hardening with resolve. "I'll find a way to get you out, even if it means burning down this entire cursed town." "No," Elizabeth said firmly, grasping his hands through the bars. "Promise me you won't do anything foolish. Promise me you won't throw your life away for mine." Thomas looked into her eyes, seeing the woman he loved, the mother of his unborn child, the innocent soul condemned to die for crimes she had never committed. "I can't promise that," he said. "I won't promise that." "Then promise me this," Elizabeth said, her voice growing urgent as footsteps echoed in the corridor above. "If something happens to me, if you can't save me, promise me you'll live. Promise me you'll find happiness again, for both of us." "Time's up," Silas called softly from the stairs. "You need to go now." Thomas pressed his lips to Elizabeth's through the bars, tasting salt and sorrow. "I love you," he whispered. "And I will save you, both of you. That's a promise I can keep." As he climbed the stairs back to the world above, Thomas's mind was already working, forming plans, discarding options, searching for any weakness he could exploit. He had 2 days left, and he would use every second of them. Love had brought them to this point, and love would see them through, or they would die together, trying. The Cooper farmhouse stood in darkness, its windows shuttered tight against the night. Thomas crouched in the shadows beside the barn, his heart hammering as he waited for Samuel Cooper to emerge from his evening chores. The man had been avoiding him since the trial, crossing the street whenever he saw Thomas approaching, his eyes filled with the same fear that had infected the entire town. When Cooper finally stepped out of the barn, Thomas rose from his hiding place like a ghost materializing from the darkness. The older man nearly dropped his lantern, his face going pale in the flickering light. "Thomas Whitmore," Cooper breathed, his voice shaking. "What are you doing here? If anyone sees you, your son would be dead without her," Thomas said without preamble. "Elizabeth saved little Samuel's life, and you know it." Cooper's face crumpled with guilt and shame. "I know, God help me, I know. But Thomas, you don't understand what's happening in this town. The fever is spreading. Everyone's looking for someone to blame, someone to accuse. If I speak up for her..." "If you don't, an innocent woman dies," Thomas interrupted. "An innocent woman and her unborn child." The words hit Cooper like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his lantern swaying dangerously. She's with child." Thomas nodded grimly. "My child. They're going to burn her alive tomorrow night, Samuel. They're going to murder my family because of lies and fear." Cooper was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ground. When he finally looked up, Thomas saw tears in his eyes. "What do you want me to do?" "Help me get her out," Thomas said. "I have a plan, but I need men I can trust. Men who remember what Elizabeth has done for this community." Cooper shook his head frantically. "It's impossible. The jail is too well guarded, and even if we could free her, where would she go? Every settlement for 100 miles knows about the witch trials. She'd be hunted like an animal. Then we'll take her somewhere they can't follow," Thomas said. "West, to the frontier. I have a wagon, supplies, enough money to start over. But I need a distraction, something to draw the guards away from the jail." "Thomas, this is madness," Cooper whispered. "If we're caught, we're all dead anyway," Thomas said bitterly. "Don't you see? This hysteria won't end with Elizabeth. It will spread until every person in Salem has been accused, until the whole town burns itself to the ground. At least this way we're fighting back." Cooper was quiet again, wrestling with his conscience. Finally he nodded. "What do you need me to do?" Over the next hour, Thomas laid out his plan. It was desperate, dangerous, and would require perfect timing, but it was their only chance. Cooper would gather 3 other men, Martha Proctor's son, David, who owed Elizabeth a debt for nursing his mother through her final illness, young Peter Nurse, whose sister had been saved from drowning by Elizabeth's quick thinking, and old Benjamin Corey, who had no love for Reverend Blackwood after the preacher had tried to seize his land for the church. "We'll need a diversion," Thomas explained. "Something big enough to draw the guards away from the jail. The execution pyre is being built in the town square. If it were to catch fire accidentally..." Cooper's eyes widened. "You want us to burn down the town square?" "Just the pyre," Thomas said. "And maybe a few other strategic locations. Nothing that would endanger innocent lives, but enough to create chaos. While everyone's fighting the fires, I'll get Elizabeth out through the back entrance of the jail. And then what? Then we disappear," Thomas said. "All of us. Because once this is over, there's no going back." As Thomas made his way home through the dark streets, he felt a mixture of hope and terror warring in his chest. The plan was risky, but it was better than doing nothing. Better than watching the woman he loved burn alive while he stood helpless. He slipped into his house through the back door, careful not to wake his brother. But as he entered the main room, he found Jacob waiting for him, sitting in their father's old chair with a grim expression on his face. "I know what you're planning," Jacob said quietly. "Samuel Cooper isn't as discreet as he thinks he is." Thomas's hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt. Are you going to try to stop me?" "No," Jacob said, surprising him. "I'm going to help you." Thomas stared at his brother in shock. "But you said—" "I said a lot of things," Jacob interrupted. "But I've been thinking about what you told me about Elizabeth being with child. And I've been remembering the woman I used to know before this madness took hold of our town. She doesn't deserve to die for the crime of showing mercy." Relief flooded through Thomas like a tide. "Jacob, Don't thank me yet," Jacob said, rising from the chair. "This plan of yours is going to get us all killed, but I'd rather die fighting for what's right than live with the shame of doing nothing." As the brothers clasped hands in the darkness, Thomas felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. Perhaps there was still some justice left in the world after all. Perhaps love could triumph over fear and truth over lies. Tomorrow would bring the ultimate test. Tomorrow, they would either save Elizabeth and her child or die trying. But tonight, for the first time in days, Thomas Whitmore dared to hope. The sun hung low in the sky like a crimson eye, casting long shadows across Salem's town square as the execution hour approached. Thomas positioned himself at the edge of the crowd, his heart pounding so hard he was certain everyone could hear it. The pyre stood in the center of the square like a wooden mountain, its kindling carefully arranged to ensure maximum suffering for the condemned. Elizabeth was led from the jail in chains, her head held high despite the jeers and curses hurled at her by the bloodthirsty crowd. Thomas bit back a cry of anguish when he saw how pale she had become, how the weight of her ordeal had carved new lines around her eyes. But her spirit remained unbroken, and when their gazes met across the mob, she offered him the faintest smile. Reverend Blackwood stood beside the pyre like a vulture in black robes, his pale eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Behold," he proclaimed, his voice carrying across the square, "the wages of sin. Let this be a lesson to all who would traffic with the devil." Thomas checked the position of the sun. Any moment now the diversion would begin. Cooper and the others were in position around the square, hidden among the crowd with torches concealed beneath their cloaks. Jacob waited in the shadows near the jail's back entrance, ready to overpower any guards left behind. As Elizabeth was bound to the stake, Thomas felt bile rise in his throat. The rough ropes bit into her wrists, and he could see her lips moving in what he assumed was prayer. She looked so small against the towering pile of wood, so vulnerable and alone. The crowd pressed closer, hungry for blood, their faces twisted with a madness that made them look like demons in human form. "Have you any last words?" Judge Hawthorne asked, his voice cold and formal. Elizabeth lifted her chin, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the square. "I forgive you all," she said simply. "May God have mercy on your souls, for you know not what you do." The words seemed to hang in the air like an accusation, and Thomas saw several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. But their moment of doubt passed quickly, swept away by the fever of the mob. Reverend Blackwood raised his torch, the flames dancing in his pale eyes. "By fire we purge this evil from our midst," he declared. "Let the flames cleanse this land of corruption." That was the signal. Across the square, Cooper's torch found its mark on the spare wood pile behind the church. David Proctor set fire to the haystack near the courthouse. Peter Nurse ignited the merchant stalls at the far end of the square. Within moments, half a dozen fires bloomed like deadly flowers in the gathering dusk. "Fire!" someone screamed. "The whole town's burning!" Chaos erupted. The crowd scattered in all directions, some running toward the fires with buckets, others fleeing in panic. In the confusion, Thomas saw his chance. He drew his pistol and fired a shot into the air, adding to the pandemonium, then fought his way through the mob toward the pyre. Blackwood stood frozen for a moment, torn between his desire to complete the execution and his need to control the spreading fires. That moment of hesitation cost him everything. Thomas slammed into the Reverend like a battering ram, sending them both tumbling to the ground. The torch flew from Blackwood's hand, landing harmlessly in the dirt. "Stop him!" Blackwood shrieked, but his voice was lost in the roar of flames and shouting crowds. Thomas leaped onto the pyre, his knife slicing through Elizabeth's bonds with desperate speed. Her legs buckled when he freed her, and he caught her in his arms, feeling how light she had become after days without proper food. "I told you I'd save you," he whispered against her hair. "Thomas." Jacob's voice rang out from behind them. "Guards coming from the jail!" Thomas turned to see 3 armed men pushing through the chaos, their faces grim with purpose. He lifted Elizabeth in his arms and jumped down from the pyre, his boots hitting the ground hard. Pain shot through his ankle, but he ignored it, carrying Elizabeth toward the waiting horses. A musket ball whistled past his ear, and he heard the crack of gunpowder behind them. The guards were closing in, and Thomas realized with growing horror that they might not make it after all. His legs burned with exhaustion, and Elizabeth's weight, slight as it was, seemed to grow heavier with each step. "Leave me," Elizabeth gasped. "Save yourself." "Never," Thomas growled, pushing forward with the last of his strength. Just as the guards closed the distance, Cooper appeared like an avenging angel, swinging a heavy wooden beam that sent 2 of the men sprawling. The 3rd guard raised his musket, but Jacob's knife found its mark first, and the man crumpled to the ground. They had done it. Against all odds, they had actually done it. But as Thomas looked back at the burning square, at the faces of those who had tried to murder the woman he loved, he knew their real battle was just beginning. The horses' hooves thundered against the frozen ground as Thomas and Elizabeth fled through the Massachusetts wilderness, their breath forming clouds in the bitter winter air. Behind them, the glow of Salem's fires painted the night sky crimson, a fitting farewell to the town that had tried to murder an innocent woman and her unborn child. Thomas glanced back to see Jacob and the others following close behind, their faces grim but determined. They had burned their bridges, quite literally, and there was no going back now. But as he felt Elizabeth's arms tighten around his waist, he knew they had made the right choice. They rode hard through the night, stopping only to rest the horses and check on Elizabeth's condition. She was weak from her ordeal, but her spirit remained strong, and when morning came, Thomas was relieved to see color returning to her cheeks. "Where will we go?" she asked, as they shared a meager breakfast of bread and dried meat beside a frozen stream. "West," Thomas said, pulling her close against the cold. "To the frontier, where no one knows our names or our faces. We'll find a place where our child can grow up free, away from this madness." 3 weeks later, they reached the settlement of Springfield, a rough frontier town where questions weren't asked and past troubles were left behind. Thomas used the last of his savings to purchase a small plot of land and the materials to build a modest cabin. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and it was far from the reach of Salem's witch hunters. Cooper and the others had scattered to different towns, each choosing his own path to freedom. Only Jacob had stayed with them, helping Thomas build their new home and starting a small farm of his own nearby. The brotherhood forged in fire had proven stronger than blood, and Thomas was grateful to have his brother by his side. As spring arrived and Elizabeth's pregnancy progressed, Thomas began to believe they might actually find peace in this new land. The townspeople of Springfield were friendly but distant, more concerned with surviving the harsh frontier life than with digging into their neighbors' pasts. But their peace was shattered on a warm May morning when a stranger rode into town. Thomas recognized him immediately, Deputy Marshal William Kane, one of Reverend Blackwood's most loyal followers. The man's cold eyes swept the town square, and Thomas knew their past had finally caught up with them. "Hide," Thomas told Elizabeth, helping her into the root cellar beneath their cabin. "Whatever happens, don't come out until I tell you it's safe." Kane found him an hour later, working in the fields behind their home. The deputy marshal was flanked by 2 armed men, their faces hard with purpose. "Thomas Whitmore," Kane called out, his hand resting on his pistol. "By order of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you're under arrest for aiding and abetting a known witch." "Elizabeth was innocent," Thomas said, slowly straightening from his work. "The whole trial was a sham, and you know it." Kane's laugh was cold and humorless. "Innocent? She bewitched half the town, including you. Where is she, Whitmore? Where's the witch?" "Gone," Thomas lied. Died of fever 2 months ago. You're too late." "I don't believe you," Cain snarled. "Search the house." As the men moved toward the cabin, Thomas made his choice. He couldn't let them find Elizabeth, couldn't let them drag her back to Salem to face the stake, not when she was so close to giving birth to their child. Thomas launched himself at Cain, his hands closing around the deputy's throat. They went down hard, rolling in the dirt as Cain's men shouted and raised their weapons. Thomas felt Cain's knife slide between his ribs, felt the hot flow of blood soaking his shirt, but he held on with desperate strength. The gunshot echoed across the valley like thunder. Thomas felt the bullet tear through his shoulder, spinning him away from Cain and onto his back. Blood pooled beneath him, and he could taste copper in his mouth. "Should have made this easy on yourself," Cain gasped, struggling to his feet. But then Jacob appeared like an avenging angel, his musket smoking in his hands. Cain's men were down, and the deputy marshal himself clutched a spreading red stain on his chest. "You picked the wrong family to hunt," Jacob said coldly. As Cain collapsed, Thomas felt Elizabeth's hands on his face, saw her tears falling like rain. "I told you to hide," he whispered. "I couldn't let you face them alone," she said, pressing her hands against his wounds to stop the bleeding. Thomas survived his injuries, though he would carry the scars for the rest of his life. Their son was born healthy and strong 3 months later, and they named him Samuel, after the boy whose life had started it all. Years passed in their frontier home, and the witch trials of Salem became a distant nightmare. Thomas and Elizabeth raised their family in peace, far from the fear and superstition that had nearly destroyed them. They never spoke of returning to Massachusetts, content to build their new life from the ashes of the old. And sometimes on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the trees, Thomas would hold Elizabeth close and remember the moment he had chosen love over safety, justice over fear. It had cost them everything they had known, but it had given them something far more precious. A chance at true freedom, and a love that had proven stronger than death itself.